Hi everyone, welcome back to our digital event. My name is Chad, I'm the programs coordinator here. Today we're inside the Harper House and I'm joined by former programs coordinator and current site manager at House on the Horseshoe, Amanda Brantley, and she's going to give us a little bit more insight onto what civilian life was like for the people of Bentonville.
We're currently standing in the parlor of the Harper House. This house was built around 1855 by John and Amy Harper. And in this house, the Harpers raised their family of 9 children. The Harpers had a very comfortable living here in the village of Bentonville. They were farmers. John Harper's farm consisted mostly of the crops of corn, sweet potatoes, peas and beans, as well as hay for his livestock. The livestock on the farm consisted of milk cows, beef cattle, sheep, as well as poultry. There also would have been an orchard somewhere on the property as well. The Harpers were not dissimilar from their neighbors. Most of the people of the village of Bentonville farmed the same things. This was not a very large industrial area as far as agriculture goes. The main industry of this area would have been naval stores, which is the tar, pitch, and turpentine that would have been tapped out of the pine trees. And while John Harper probably would have had some acreage in the turpentine industry, most of that would have been further up the village. We know that one of his neighbors, Willis Cole, actually had multiple acres tied up in the turpentine industry based on stumps that have been found in recent years. The village of Bentonville actually had a turpentine distillery, and that would have been a lot of the labor force around here as well. The 1860 census tells us that they do have multiple day laborers as well as laborers tied up within the turpentine industry. And while John Harper's not dealing a whole lot in that, he would have been here on his farm every day, as well as his children. And having 9 children, this would have been a very chaotic house, especially when they were young. But as they got older and as the war got closer to the Harpers, they, like most other families in the South, were not untouched by the perils of war. They actually have 3 family members serve in the Confederate Army. Their second oldest son, Martin, enlists in about 1862 and is wounded in the arm at South Mountain and is transferred into the Invalid Corps. And at the time of the battle here in March of 1865, he's actually in Raleigh. In September of 1864, their other son, Henry, enlists and is actually serving as a courier for Colonel Stephen Poole in the eastern part of the state. So he's not here. And then, of course, the most tragic loss during the war is their oldest child, Caroline Harper. Her husband, William Hudson, had been captured, sent to Elmira Prison in New York, and had died in December of 1864. So the Harpers, of course, are aware of the realities of war as they themselves have had a son injured, as well as a son-in-law die. And after he died, Caroline probably moved back home, and she would have brought with her 2 daughters, Anna and Frances, who were about ages 2 and 4 in 1865. We're currently upstairs in the Harper House. Originally, all 4 of the rooms upstairs were bedrooms used by the family. And as I mentioned earlier, the Harpers had 9 children that were raised in this house. And if you're doing the quick math in your head, you can realize not everyone has their own bedroom. In the mid-19th century, it was very common to share bedrooms and even beds with your siblings. Whether or not all 9 children lived in the house at one time, we're still unsure. We do know their oldest daughter, Caroline, is married by 1860. So there's still going to be some sharing going on amongst the younger siblings, especially if John and Amy's bedroom was upstairs as well. These rooms would have offered a place of comfort for the family during the battle. On March 19, 1865, the Union Army is marching literally in front of their house and gets attacked by entrenched Confederates. Of course, the Harpers would have been completely aware of the battle going on around them, so they were probably already taking shelter upstairs. Halfway through the day on March 19th, the Union Army commandeers this house to be used as the 14th Corps Field Hospital. This hospital, through the course of 3 days, will treat about 500 wounded soldiers, both Union and Confederate. During those days, the Harpers would have been upstairs. Of course, the battle is still raging outside, in addition to their downstairs and their yard being used as a field hospital. The younger children, of course, we do have Anna and Francis who are here. They're about ages 2 and 4, all the way up to John Harper, who is about 65 years old. Now, at the time of the battle, there are only 6 of their children living here. Their oldest son, John James, is a minister, and by being a minister, he was exempt from Confederate conscription. His house is actually up in the village of Bentonville. During the course of the battle, probably on the 3rd day, his house is burned. He may have ended up here with his wife and daughter as well, even more increasing the Harper numbers here at the time of the battle. As I mentioned earlier, 2 of their sons are serving in the Confederate Army, and their oldest child, Caroline, has moved back home with her 2 daughters. So the rooms up here would have been in a state of chaos, in addition to the downstairs being used as a hospital. We are currently standing in the Harper House kitchen, and while this building is not original to the Harper property, they would have had a building very similar here on the farm. Kitchens were very utilitarian. There wasn't really a whole lot of frivolity to them, but this would have been a very important family building. Of course, the Harpers had 9 children. This is a very large family to feed. And here in the kitchen, we probably would have found a woman by the name of Lucy. Lucy was an enslaved woman here on the Harper farm. The enslaved population here on the Harper farm varied from the 1850 to the 1860 census. What we do find is we have 2 records of the Harpers actually purchasing enslaved persons. In 1835, they first purchased Lucy, who is 16 years old, and her 7-month-old son, Alexander, from James Woodard, Amy Harper's father, for the sum of $600. Lucy and Alec, as he has come to be known, actually stay on the farm until emancipation. We can kind of track them on into 1870. Again, in 1843, the Harpers purchased 2 additional enslaved persons, Elizur and Oliver. They are purchased for the sum of $600 from Calvin Jernigan, and Calvin Jernigan was a local man here in Johnston County. And while 1850 gives us 5 enslaved persons here on the Harper farm, we can assume that 4 of them are Lucy, Alexander, Elizur, and Oliver. The 5th one we probably believe is a female slave named Clarcy or Clarissa. Well, we don't have a record of how the Harpers get her. She is listed in the 1870 census as Alec Harper's wife, living in the village or township of Piney Green. We don't know a whole lot about the roles of the slaves here on the Harper farm. Like many 19th century enslaved, they would have been farm laborers. We believe Lucy was the cook. She was the oldest female, and that was a traditional role. The only account from the battle we have of a family member comes from 1901, when one of the Harper's daughters, Martha, is speaking to an audience, and she starts her address with, back in the old days when the cook would cook in the kitchen and bring the meals to the big house. That lets us know that the Harpers would have had a cook here on the farm. Alec probably would have been involved in everyday farming tasks. So as we mentioned earlier, this is a very functioning farm. This is an average sized farm for the mid-19th century, and there would have been plenty to do. And of course, Clarissa, we don't know exactly what her day-to-day task would have been. She could have been here assisting Lucy in the kitchen, of course, cooking for such a large family. She could have acted as a nurse for the children when they were younger. She could have been helping Alec around the farm with the many things that needed to be done. But what we do know is by 1870, of course, emancipation is passed. It's 1870, they're free. The Harper slaves that were here, we find find at least 2 of them about 20 miles away in the village of Piney Green, or in the township of Piney Green. We do have, of course, Alec Harper, his wife Clarissa, and they have a number of children living with them as well that we assume are their own. But also living beside them is a couple by the name of Abram Harper and Charity Harper. Now, while they're not listed, of course, none of the enslaved are listed by name in the 1860 slave schedules, and there's only 3 listed. We don't know where these additional Harper, presumably Harper enslaved, come from. When Amy Harper's mother, Anna, died, in her will in 1863, she left a number of enslaved persons to her daughter, Amy. And we don't know if that actually came to fruition or not, because emancipation had already occurred in 1863, but of course the lines become a little sketchy here in the South. But what we do know is in 1866, Abram and Charity actually register with a cohabitation marriage license. And what that is it's former slaves who after the war go to the magistrate or go to an office and say, we have been married from this day, and they actually get it certified. So Abram and Charity go on August 26th, 1866 to have their marriage recognized. And in the document it says that they have been living together, cohabitating as a married couple from 1863, which leads us to believe that if not here on this Harper farm, would have somehow been connected to one of the Harper children. We don't know much about the now free Harpers after about 1870 or 1880. We do find a Clarcy Harper at the age of 80 living in Alabama, and she's employed as a cook. And in this census record where we find her, it says that she had mothered 11 children. In the 1870 census, she's listed as having 4 or 5. And she's living with one of her daughters named Charlotte. And Charlotte shows up in the 1880 census with her as well. So what we can assume is that Clarcy ends her life in Alabama at the age of 80, but we don't know when her husband Alec died. I'm here now at the Johnson's headquarters tour stop on the battlefield. In 1865, the village sat over here just behind me. On March 21st, 1865, Johnson's headquarters would have been right in the field that you see here. On the morning of March 21st, it is overrun by Mower's division of the Union Army, sending Johnson fleeing towards Mill Creek. Now, had you been here in 1865 or a couple of years prior, the village itself would have been comprised of multiple buildings. The structures would have included storehouses, a carriage shop, a turpentine distillery, and multiple supporting buildings. John Hood, who owned the carriage shop, his home had actually been commandeered and used as a Confederate field hospital here during the battle. His house is destroyed, as is most of the village, including John and Amy Harper's son, John James. His house would have sat somewhere here adjacent to the village as well in 1865. And as we mentioned earlier, it is burned during the destruction of the village and sending him and his family possibly back to his parents' house slightly after the battle. The turpentine distillery that sat here was a hub of employment here for the community. According to the 1860 census, there are multiple turpentine workers here in this area. In addition to the turpentine workers, we do have a couple of other specialized skill laborers here. I mentioned earlier John Hood. He owns a carriage shop. There are about half a dozen mechanics listed in the 1860 census as well. Another supporting trade to the turpentine industry is that there is a blacksmith here and coopers. Coopers, of course, would make the barrels to store the turpentine and the other products in. But what's interesting about the blacksmith here in 1860 is that he is a free man of color. He and his family are listed here. His name is Levi Booth. He's about 56 years old when he and his family are living here in 1860. But because of the destruction in the village, by 1870 and 1880, he's actually moved up to Smithfield and becomes a farmer. Another supporting tradesmen that would have been here is a man named Rufus Seabury. Rufus Seabury is another free man of color that is employed here in the village of Bentonville. He's a miller. Now, he does stay in this area, but he becomes a farm laborer. So because of the destruction of the village, they both lose their jobs and have to find alternate employment, which is not unlike many of the other residents here during 1860 and in 1865, right after the battle. As we mentioned earlier, we talked about the Harpers. John and Amy Harper, of course, managed to keep their house. After the Union Army leaves, the hospital is no longer functioning. The Harpers, of course, are left with over 20 Confederate wounded soldiers that they have to take care of. Their son, John James, talks about the account, and he says all of the buildings, including the smokehouse, were full of wounded soldiers, and that their parents and his mother, Amy especially, was left to tend to them and became chaplains and nurses, and even wrapped their cold bodies in blankets and put them in the ground when they died. But the Harpers are very lucky in that they do get to keep their house. Unlike the Coles, of course, the coal plantation is burned during the battle. They have to find somewhere else to live. The Harpers even managed to keep most of their land. In 1860, they have over 500 acres. By 1870, it's down to almost a little over 300 acres. So while they did lose part of their land, they still kept most of their livelihood. Again, they're a couple of miles away from the village. They weren't threatened the way a lot of the residents here were threatened, but they still managed to pick up some pieces of their life and keep going. We're now standing in front of the Harper Family Cemetery. John and Amy Harper, along with some of their children and grandchildren, are buried here behind me. John Harper died in 1897. His wife, Amy, died in 1901. The Harpers were able to live out their lives here on their farm. Around 1895, they got too old and feeble to take care of such a large house and moved in with one of their children in Dunn. Of course, after they died, they were brought back here to their family farm and buried. The Harper children, a few of which are buried here behind me, did multiple things after the war. All the things. Their oldest child, Caroline, of course, her husband William, had died during the war. She remarries a Bentonville veteran in 1867, and they stay here in the Bentonville community. Their second oldest child, John James Harper, who was a minister, goes on to represent Atlantic Christian College. He becomes one of the first presidents of Atlantic Christian College, which is today Barton College, and he also becomes a North Carolina state senator. Henry, one of their sons, becomes a dentist. Of course, he fought in the Civil War, and he becomes a dentist, goes to medical school in Kentucky, becomes a dentist at practice in Kinston. Their other son, Martin, who served in the Confederate Army, who was injured in the arm at South Mountain, had always wanted to become a surgeon. Unfortunately, because of his injury, he is unable to become a surgeon, but does become a general practitioner and practices medicine in Dunn. Also in Dunn, North Carolina, their daughter Martha and her husband Nathan Hood. Nathan was a minister, and Martin and Nathan go into business together and actually on a Harper and Hood drugstore, which you can find advertisements for in the late 19th century newspapers. Martha and Nathan never had any surviving children, and they actually have Hood Memorial Church located in downtown Dunn named for them. After Amy Harper dies in 1901, John James is named executor of the estate. And because the Harper children already have their own homes, their own lives, the Harper house and the remaining farmland is sold. The house was sold to the state of North Carolina in 1957 in preparation for the commemoration of the centennial of the American Civil War. Today the Harper House has been restored, and you can take a tour and see how the house would have been set up during the battle here in 1865. Hear the stories of the surgeons, the soldiers, as well as the family who endured the battle here 156 years ago.